Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here with us tonight. We're going to get started soon, but I'm going to go over some things first. My name is Volz. I'm going to be moderating the conversation. I'm with Lilac, one of the co-sponsoring groups of this event. First of all, I want to thank everybody for their patience and flexibility while we figured out how to adapt this event to a rapidly changing world. And so, like I had said, we had debated about whether to cancel or postpone the event, but we really wanted to do it because we feel it's really important to come together and talk about how the pandemic illustrates the need for large-scale mobilizing and restructuring of our economy and social services, and how that fits in with a Green New Deal. Why is the Green Deal essential as a response to the coronavirus pandemic? Why, or what could a Green New Deal look like in Philly? We're going to be talking about these things. And so personally speaking, I also hope that this is just the first in a series of events and conversations between us as individuals and groups, and that we keep talking to each other and sharing ideas about what a Green New Deal looks like. Because we build a Green Deal through keeping in touch and staying connected as organizations, as individuals, connect our work and our different areas of focus to a Green New Deal, because, you know, a Green New Deal, the future we want, it's all connected, and we're going to only get there by working together. And hopefully this is just one of many conversations in that process. So I'm excited to get started. I want to thank all the co-sponsors of the event: 215 People's Alliance, 350 Philly, Power, Lilac, the Sunrise Movement, Philly Thrive, the Movement Alliance Project, which was formerly the Media Mobilizing Project, Reclaim Philly, Philly DSA, and PA Working Families. Also want to thank our speakers, Kate Aronoff and Daniel Aldana Cohen. To quickly run through the agenda in a few minutes, we're going to break everyone into small groups, just so you can have a chance to talk to other people in this age of quarantine and social distance. You know, talk to other people, get ideas flowing. Mostly, I want people to think about what specifically you want to get out of this call. You know, there's going to be a lot of discussion time later, so hopefully your ideas are what drives the conversation. So, you know, brainstorm about that. Then our speakers will be presenting for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have the open discussion and Q&A. Just to quickly introduce them, Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at the New Republic and a senior fellow at Data for Progress. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Intercept, The New York Times, The Nation, Harper's, Jacobin, Dissent, and In These Times, among others. With Michael Kazin and Peter Dreyer, she's the co-editor of We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style. And Daniel Aldana Cohen is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. He's a senior fellow at Data for Progress and a member of People's Action's Homes Guarantee campaign policy team. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Nature, The Nation, Jacobin, Public Books, the Verso blog, and Dissent. So yeah, I'm gonna let them take it away.
Everyone for coming. I was saying this in the breakout group, but I wish I could be there in person. Unfortunately, that is not the way the world has worked out in the last several weeks, so hopefully sometime soon. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about this sort of wild moment we're in and how it relates to our book. And then we'll get into some of the content, which dovetails really well, and then Daniel will talk about other parts of the book and fill in, you know, whatever I left off. So yeah, just to, you know, say a little bit about where we are. I mean, there's obviously books will be written about this moment in the years to come. The one thing that I have been really noticing, I think today especially, is just how many of the lies we've been told about the economy is crumbling down, right? We have been told for years that any sort of, you know, spending we want to do on anything really that makes people's lives better, anything other than a war, essentially, or tax breaks for the wealthy. That's just too expensive. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the money for it. We need to focus on other things. You know, that's nice that you have these dreams, but give it up, right? And we see that's just not the case at all, right? There was, you know, we knew this already, but there has never been a shortage of money in the United States. There's been a shortage of political will to do the things we need with it, right? We had, you know, Secretary Steve Mnuchin talking today about how this is not the time to worry about the deficit, floating a stimulus package that is a mess in you know, nearly every way possible, but that is notably over $1 trillion. And we talk a little bit in the introduction of this book about the last economic crisis, and how Obama's advisors, most notably Larry Summers, in a now kind of infamous memo, refused to pass a stimulus that was more than $1 trillion. Just flat out refused. That was not going to fly. America's too conservative for that. We can't do it. So we are seeing now that that's a total lie, right? And we have this sort of wild, very scary, I think, unstable moment that I think it can be, frankly, you know, can be a little hard to see political possibility in it. But I think that's exactly what's there. And we are, as in any crisis, you know, as people like me on the planet have written about, whatever sort of ideas are lying around are the ones that will get picked up. And the right, as we know, has a lot of very bad ideas to privatize things, to hand more money away to the wealthiest actors in society, and as we've been seeing, to bail out some of the most carbon-intensive industries on the planet, airlines, cruise lines, et cetera, and bail out in the sense of giving, essentially handing money over to the CEOs of these companies to do whatever they want with it, right? Just to, you know, pour that into stock buybacks, to fire workers, to, you know, continue doing the same sort of shady and often speculative activity that they have been doing for years. And, you know, the narrative here is a little less clear than, you know, in the financial crisis, but this is not, you know, these are not all the types of activity that we need going into the future. This is not the sort of foundations of a stable 21st century economy to be pouring money into the world's most carbon intensive sectors. And so what I and Daniel and Thea, Ria Francos and Alyssa Battistoni and I lay out are, you know, in the book are some better ideas to both for the Green New Deal itself and also how to use, you know, these political moments which never seem ideal, right? There's never going to be some crisis which comes along and seems perfectly suited to, you know, put eco-socialism into, right? That is not, unfortunately, how the world works, right? But these are moments of rupture, these are moments of disruption, and moments of possibility, even when they can, you know, cannot feel like that. So one idea that I have been writing about recently and that we talk about in the book, and I'll talk briefly about here, is the concept of nationalizing the fossil fuel industry, and in a related way, bringing electric utilities under public ownership, which I think relate back to, you know, where we are now in a sort of interesting way. So to start with the fossil fuel industry itself, this is one of the industries that the White House has sort of suggested that we prop up, which is interesting considering this is an industry which, as we know, and I'm sure everyone in this call is familiar with, has been destroying the planet for decades. But the type of extraction that we do most here in the United States, shale drilling in particular, has never been on its own, you know, on purely business terms, leaving the climate aside, has never been sustainable, right? These companies have by and large never turned a profit. They are funded by massive amounts of debt. They, you know, have just taken essentially the largesse of Wall Street and the kind of low interest rate economy that's persisted since the last recession, and just built these giant companies, essentially drilling up fuel we don't need, right? Drilling up gas and oil that there was no pressing domestic demand for, that there was no real need for, purely just to make people rich, right? And so we are in this, kind of new era, very, very reduced demand for oil. There's, other factors at play. There's geopolitical factors. There is the, increasing divestment, in part at the behest of social movements and climate organizers around the world from fossil fuel stocks. These companies are reaching a real reckoning point, particularly US-based natural gas and oil drillers in the sort of shale sector. And so with these, mounting levels of corporate debt, sort of bond maturities coming due this year and the next 5 years, it's very likely that these companies will go bankrupt, that many of them will go bankrupt. We saw a rash of those last year. We're likely to see more going forward. And we kind of know, we've already seen what the White House's response to that will be, which will be to bail those companies out. And so what does that look like? As we know from bailouts past, that will, give money to the CEOs and leave all of the workers in the industry. There are about, 1.6 million nationwide, which is not insignificant. Essentially leave people out to dry, right? And not just workers in those sectors, but entire communities. There are, places like West Texas, there are communities around Appalachia, who have tax bases which are hugely dependent on these extractive industries. These are well-paid jobs. For the most part, people without a high school degree can make a lot of money, which is great. And bailout that essentially forestalls a crisis that is coming for this sector will do basically nothing for them, right? And so what we propose in the book, and which I've written about more recently, sort of in the context of the last couple of weeks, is to nationalize these companies, right, which are already hugely devalued as oil prices have crashed, and to create an off-ramp away from fossil fuels and toward the low-carbon economy we need. And so what can this do? This can fund, as is in Bernie Sanders' plan for a Green New Deal, 5 years wage parity. This can, really set people up to live dignified lives. People who, have really built the economy we live in, and built, things that they have done work that deserves to be respected, and sort of provide an alternative to bankruptcy, which, as we've seen in the case of the coal industry, always screws workers over, or private equity, which is a sort of faster route toward that, right? And so this is actually a pretty simple transaction, as was pointed out yesterday. The 4 biggest oil producers in the United States could be bought up with $300 billion, which from the perspective of the federal government is relative chump change, and could wind down production very, very quickly, and make sure that energy needs are provided for, but make sure that that's not being done on a for-profit basis, and sort of taking the profit motive out of the equation, right? And making sure that the future of these companies is one that is both looking out for the people who have created value for them, and also looking out for the collective well-being of the planet. And I think what's important to note about that is that while I think nationalization, while maybe it sounds good to many people on this call, has traditionally been a sort of third rail issue in American politics in particular, for no good reason, right? We do nationalization all the time. Most recently, in the couple months after 9/11, the Bush administration nationalized airport security and created TSA, basically whole cloth, right? And displaced private industry. These sort of private companies, many of them which are involved in things like ICE detention facilities, displaced a whole swath of the private sector, and that was largely uncontroversial because it took place in the context of a crisis. And so what nationalization of the fossil fuel company can do is both be in that tradition and do something that is not very strange in American politics, and it can also sort of retool all of the existing support we already give to the fossil fuel industry. Very conservative estimates put U.S. direct and indirect subsidies to that industry at $26 billion per year. The IMF, which counts in sort of more things like sort of unpaid health costs and detriment to the environment, puts global fossil fuel subsidies at $5.1 trillion per year. So it's not as if this is a new government intervention, right? We are changing the way that the government intervenes in the economy to be for the collective well-being and not for the well-being of fossil fuel executives, right? And so I happen to think this is a pretty moderate proposal in the grand scheme of things. It's not, so far outside the lines of what we've seen before, and actually, is I think probably the best kind of path away from a sector that, as I mentioned before, is already failing, right? It's already sort of coming apart at the seams. So I think to give Daniel a bit of time, I'll talk briefly about work, and maybe we can get to talking about utilities in the Q&A. But I think, as we're thinking about what it looks like to transition workers out of the fossil fuel sector in particular, something else we talk about in the book is a much broader concept of work. Conversations about the just transition have tended to focus on what the transition looks like for people who are in the extractive industry into the clean energy economy, right? So you imagine coal miners going, or oil and gas workers going to mount solar panels on homes or businesses, or hoist up wind turbines. And what we argue in the book is there's actually a much broader array of work that is bound up in the fossil fuel economy, and there's a much broader definition of a green job, which goes well beyond, the actual, production and installation and deployment of green energy itself. And so as we're thinking about kind of what alternative employment can look like for folks, and as we transition in this economy, which is hopefully very different than the one we know, that there are already sectors of the economy which are low carbon and which have been in reality some of the most militant sectors in the economy. Thinking of teaching, I'm sure folks have been following sort of a wave of teacher strikes, most recently kicking off since 2012, the Chicago teachers strike against Rahm Emanuel, and then nursing, which has been historically very unionized sector and fairly militant unions at that. And so what we argue, and I'll sort of end it here, is that we have to really expand our definition of what counts as a green job, not only for just sort of an analytic point, in that we need a lot more low carbon work, right? But that we actually need to build powerful coalitions in order to get any of this to happen. And in order to do that, we need more people on our side. And so people have to be able to see themselves in the Green New Deal. And that is a coalition that has to extend, well beyond sort of just workers in the current extractive economy. And so I think we are excited, and I hope this comes up through the rest of the conversation, to build with folks who are, working with labor sort of across the spectrum, and to really think about how to build the biggest Green New Deal coalition possible, because we know the fossil fuel industry is not going to want to be nationalized, and that there will need to be a sort of massive amount of people power needed in order to make anything like that possible. So I'll end it there. Take it to Daniel.
Thank you so much, Kate. Kate and I, along with Tia and Alyssa, wrote this book together largely on the internet like this. So this is giving me a very pleasant flashback to being on Zoom at 3 in the morning. I'm drinking seltzer, by the way, not getting hammered, unfortunately. So, okay, let me just jump in here. I think it can be helpful to just step back for a second. What is the Green New Deal? I think that, in the book, we largely agree with the framework that AOC and Ed Markey put out in February of 2019, in the sense of a big, massive kind of transformation of the economy with, I think you could say, 4 major characteristics. One, just massive mobilization along the lines of the New Deal and World War II, not the same, but equally large mobilization to decarbonize the economy incredibly quickly, because carbon emissions are the root cause of climate change, climate emergency, which could devastate all of us. Second, fully embrace the notion of kind of universal social services. So even if it doesn't have an immediate carbon benefit, you know, free healthcare, abolish student debt, of course, free access to education, childcare, and so on. And that's extremely relevant, obviously, in the context of this pandemic. Third, jobs guarantee. The Green New Deal, I think, really stands out. And, you know, when Sunrise occupied Nancy Pelosi's office with AOC, you know, even before AOC took office, the idea of a jobs guarantee was very central. And I think this was a key way of reaching out to workers in all sectors and saying, you know, we're not going to leave you behind. This is not about facilitating the purchase of organic purple cauliflower for upper class people, which, you know, nothing wrong with organic purple cauliflower, but we have a broader agenda here. And the jobs guarantee is a key way to signal that. And something we could achieve. And then fourth, finally, direct investment in frontline communities. And I think that's a big topic in the wake of the refinery literally blowing up that we can get into as well. What does it mean to target investment in racialized and working class communities that have been left behind, that have been polluted, that have been disinvested in? And there are some models in California, emerging models in New York State. And I think that's something that would be very much necessary to pursue in Philadelphia or in PA. Philly. I live in Philly. Yeah, soft pretzels everywhere in this house. Or apartment rather. Okay, so the crisis, of course, then puts us in this position where if there's going to be a stimulus, just like Kate was saying, shouldn't it be a green stimulus? I mean, in what insane world do we have like a once in a decade economic reset and we use all of our resources to A, make Trump look generous, and B, bail out the fossil fuel industry? We can't do that. Thanks, Sas, I saw that. Soft pretzels for all. We can't do that. So we need something else. So in the book, we talk about the need to nationalize the fossil fuel industry, as Kate laid out, the need to bring the whole wide spectrum of care work under the umbrella of green jobs, as Kate also talked about. And I think that's very relevant, again, for this pandemic, that we see a society of care, caring for ecosystems and caring for other people as really what the Green New Deal is ultimately for, right? Like our vision of utopia isn't building solar panels. Our vision of utopia is spending time with people we love and taking care of each other. And the Green New Deal is how we get there. So we put care work at the front. Then comes this question of transforming the built environment. And no doubt this will be easier to do, including in Philly and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, especially in red and poor states, easier to do with federal money. But there are things we can start to do in PA. So what does it mean to decarbonize the energy system and the built environment? That obviously means building more solar panels and wind turbines. I think everybody who's joined this Zoom link knows that. Otherwise, you're on the wrong part of the internet for your interests. So I think we can move beyond the question of we need to build more renewable energy. But what we also need to do actually is use less energy overall. Because every time we build a wind turbine or build a solar panel, what are we doing is we're using up physical materials, minerals, metals, and so on from all around the world. And we have to limit how much mining and materials we use. I mean, we just cannot grow the physical economy indefinitely at all. And we can't take away solar panels and wind turbines and batteries that would be needed in places like the global south. They don't have the same kind of spending power that we have. So we need to use less energy. And to do that, we need to transform our transportation system away from being car driven to much more collective services. We do obviously have to replace gas cars or ICE, internal combustion engine cars, with electric vehicles. But I think on the whole, we want far fewer cars. To make that feasible, we need to really radically expand mass transit, which again, everybody here would know. I would argue we need to expand mass transit first. Most people in Philly will know there's a constant fight between these like Philly urbanists who are very excited about getting rid of cars, and a lot of working class and racialized communities that don't want to lose their parking when they don't see, they don't have the money to take Lyft every day. They don't see the transit as an alternative. And so I think we see an investment-oriented approach that says, electrify SEPTA, get electric buses first into Black and brown communities, get them running much more often so that you are dependably able to get where you need to go on transit. We should work towards free bus transit. That's already a campaign in Boston. We should have it here. Eventually, all public transit should be free. Certainly fare capping, certainly should not have to pay for transfers, but you should be able to get out of the house, have a destination in mind, and know that the bus is going to come right by within 5 or 10 minutes automatically. And I think once we get into that direction, then we can really start talking about parking restrictions and so on. So this is a kind of investment-oriented approach to expanding public transit. And yeah, high-speed rail is great, but I don't think most people in Philly are about to take a high-speed train to New Orleans. I hope that that becomes possible soon, but I think we also have to take care of that daily commute right away. We need to decarbonize our buildings. In the Mid-Atlantic, half of Black households can't afford their utility bills. That means that they either received a utility shutoff notice in the last 6 months, or that they sacrificed on necessities like food, or that they keep their home at an unsafe temperature. Some research I've done shows that there are neighborhoods in Philly where people pay up to a quarter as much in rent as they do simply on electricity. So imagine looking at your AC unit on a very hot day in that context. So we need to really physically transform buildings. We need to give people new clean appliances, and we can get into the details of all this, but there are actually precedents already in recent US policy history. And in the context of Philly, you know, we have a municipal gas company, PGW, which I would argue we need to transform, not get rid of it, but transform it into an electrification company. And you can simply imagine that as the years go by, the share of the workforce that's doing electrification gradually takes over the entire company. So, you know, there are people who have electric stoves, there's fossil gas infrastructure, and we can't just wink it out of existence. But we can transform all of our efforts towards electrifying our buildings, making them cleaner, healthier, safer, more comfortable. And at the same time, what happens in PGW is that older folks retire and we insure their pensions, and younger people retrain into electrification. And in fact, this is going to take so much work, it'll actually probably really expand the workforce of PGW. And that will be an opportunity to provide union jobs for Black and brown working class people all across the city, who I'm sure are looking for a chance to do good work for the climate. So we could talk more about home energy retrofits. This is a big passion of mine. This is absolutely something you can start at the city level or at the state level. It'll be a lot easier to get everything done once we have federal funding, just because the volume of funding is so much larger there. And I want to note on this and many other topics I'm talking about, all of what I'm describing practically is in the platform of Nikhil Saval, wonderful, beautiful human being who's running for state senate in central Philly. And we need new social housing, we need rent control, and you know, we fundamentally need to make it so that everybody can afford to live in a healthy, safe, green home. And I could talk about housing forever, so I'm going to put that off. Let me say, and we need to expand public recreation. Part of our vision is that we're dematerializing prosperity. We're taking the amount of stuff that it takes to live well in this country now, and we're reducing that. We want to reduce work hours, and we want to have more ability to have fun. And although that sounds in a way kind of cheesy, I can tell you that actually, if you go back to the original New Deal, public recreation was around 3rd or 4th biggest line item expense of the whole public investment. Things like the Wissahickon were radically expanded during the New Deal, and they spent as much money on that as they did on sewage infrastructure. We really need that as well. I mean, people need to be able to get out of the city or get to other parts of the city in electric buses or trains and dive into the wild, dive into nature, and have a good time. And that's not, again, a joke. This is a serious part of the program of creating a better world physically for us to live in which we don't need to consume as much stuff, and we have other alternatives for a good time. Very quickly, we talk in the book about the international question at some depth, and we talk about the need not just to have an internationalism of UN meetings and resolutions. I defy any of you to go on the United Nations website and just survive in 30 minutes of clicks. I mean, you will literally run out of space on your computer just trying to save the glossary of acronyms. It's a complete disaster. And as you know, not that much gets done. I thought one of Bernie Sanders' best lines of the debate on Sunday was, you know, he talked about Paris. He's like, yeah, you want to rejoin Paris? Great, who cares? You know, it's nice, rejoin the Paris Agreement, but like, we're talking about a wartime mobilization here. And in terms of international solidarity, I think in our view, what's really essential is building solidarity across supply chains so that, for instance, communities that are on the front lines of mining for things like lithium, which we use for rechargeable batteries, are in touch with communities here that are putting those batteries in their utility systems. And we have a global justice framework that looks a lot more like the food sovereignty movement than like endless meetings at the United Nations. Of course, we keep the UN and fortify that, but we want to have a global cooperation from below. And we could talk about more about that in Q&A if people like. The last thing I want to say before we move to questions, we end the book by getting into the politics of this issue. And one of the things we talk about is, I think, an issue a lot of us are facing now as we look at the Bernie campaign, and we don't know what's going to happen. And I still think that there's a shot of them winning. And there was a poll today that showed them essentially Bernie and Biden tied, which is very exciting, but we'll see. What we talk about is going all in on climate, such an emotionally difficult issue and politically difficult. Going all in on climate is not to say if we lose at any one little point, it's over, because our timelines are so strict. Going all in on this means that if we get knocked down, we get up and we look for new opportunities and we just keep the organizing going. And so I think in the context of the stimulus, we say, well, hey, what do you know? We did some polling with Data for Progress, and a majority of Republicans support massive green investments in things like electric buses. Majority of Republicans support things like home retrofits for low-income people. So we can push and we can mobilize against Congress people. We can mobilize with a target of the Senate. We can mobilize if the target is the Biden administration. God knows Trump. I'm not very optimistic about that. We can mobilize at the city level. We can mobilize at the state level. We do have to cut emissions by 25 to 50% by 2030, but there are a lot of different ways to get there. There's direct action, which, the new Green New Deal is many things, but it is not a repudiation of blocking pipelines. Absolutely not. That's essential. So we have to have just this kind of like all out, I think, organizing mentality, which is like the Green New Deal, or essentially egalitarian decarbonization is the overarching framework. And we fight very hard for it. And we learn to fight quickly. That'll be the last note, is we talk about how Jane McAlevey, who's a great union organizer, discusses that you can turn around a moribund union in just 1 to 2 years. If you look at the Chicago teachers, the LA teachers, huge union victories, red state revolts. You often have cases where a really dedicated band of organizers goes into a union and fires it up. And we saw within the Philly union struggle, the We Caucus come very close to winning a majority, forced the existing leadership to work extremely hard to stay in power. And I think we could imagine we winning next time, or who knows, maybe the existing caucus will self-dissolve and become left-wing. But we can really build up union strength very quickly. Philly is a union town. I think there is a real opening, especially if we get green investment. We can make the argument, and then once we get some money flowing, to say, listen, at the end of the day, in Philadelphia and Philly, what it means, like culturally and politically, to be pro-working class is to be pro-green investment. Green investment is not something we want associated with Whole Foods. I mean, what we want green investment to be associated with is your buddy who went to trade school is now retrofitting buildings and making a very good living. Green investment in Philly means that your friend might run a community garden that is selling, food for a school lunch program. In Philadelphia, working in green investment, if you're a teacher, means that in your school, not only is all the asbestos being pulled out and all the mold being pulled out and the lead and all that, but the school is being retrofitted to have safe, comfortable temperatures year-round with heat pumps, that there's new funding in for wraparound services, that the schools, in fact, are resiliency centers and community centers year-round throughout the week and throughout the day. So I think that is the kind of vision we have to find a way to build towards. We've both used up a lot of time, talked a lot, so let's move to the next section. Thank you all for hanging out with me on the internet.
Thanks, Daniel and Kate. That was so good. I'm so jazzed. All right. If I could send you all a soft pretzel right now, I would. So a lot of people put questions into the chat, so I figured we could just go through those, and I'll, I guess, pose them to Daniel and Kate. So can you talk about the cost of the Green New Deal and how it would create jobs and the broader implications this has for immigration and how it could be implemented locally?
Sorry, did you say the cost of the Green New Deal?
Yes, yes.
To quote my friend Bernard, what price is too high to save the planet? The Bernie campaign proposed $16 trillion spending over 10 years. That would be roughly doubling the military budget every year, 10 years in a row. That's a lot of money. At the same time, if we look at like what Kate was talking about, $1, $2, $3 trillion stimulus, I don't think that's too much money. I think part of what we're talking about, and I'll let you jump in, Kate, is like we're not everything green is not new and doesn't exist before. It's taking things we spent money on in a bad way and now making it green. Like the US spends tens of billions of dollars on things like highway construction that could be spent instead on fixing the potholes. My God. But also on, electric buses, light rail, dedicated bus lanes, electrification of public transportation infrastructure, massive increase in frequency, many more union jobs driving these buses, and electric bus manufacturer in the US, which is also going to cost some money. So I think that part of what we're talking about is not just one whole new addition, but we're also talking about unbuilding the fossil fuel economy. So to some extent, it's also a shift, but we're not going to plan on the private sector doing that just because we slapped a 5%, a 5 cent or 20 cent or even 50 cent carbon tax. But it's an increase in public investment and a shift to public investment, and to essentially mobilize every single dime that we can squeeze out of the computers at the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think one thing that's helpful in thinking about this whole question is to think of the Green New Deal less either certainly as a bill, something that we're going to pass through some big omnibus package, or even a set of bills or a set of investments, whatever it is. I think, the New Deal is not was not a perfect blueprint, right, for what we're trying to do, certainly. But I think what's instructive about it in thinking about a Green New Deal is that this was a style of governance, right? This was not a set of programs. This was an ethic. This was a new social contract for what the balance is between the public and the private sector, what it is the government owes to its people, and how it is that we all interact with each other, and what it is that society values, right? And that was the basis on which it proceeded. And I think, in that context, there's almost nothing that doesn't fall under that, and that is right when we're thinking about the climate crisis, right? There is no policy field in the next, ever potentially, right, over the next decade and through the end of the century, for the foreseeable future, we will need to live in a zero carbon world if we're going to avert the sort of worst case scenario. And so rather than, I think, thinking about the Green New Deal as we need public transit, we need public housing, we need to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. What does it look like to really apply this to our idea of, what it is a government does, right? Like, how do we think about what, the very mission of what an economy is, and, what kinds of goals we need to be chasing. The main goal of our economy for the last several decades, and really not that much longer before that, was to grow GDP indefinitely, right? And we know that that is not a terribly good way even to make people happy. It's not a good way to, distribute society's vast resources equitably. And we can, place more sort of value claims on what it is that we want to be investing in. And I think that is, to a certain extent already done. I mean, I mentioned the fossil fuel industry and that there's many, many ways in which the government already provides ample support to certain sectors of industry, sort of without saying that this is industrial policy, without saying that this is planning, but that's exactly what it is, right? When we hand over $26 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry, that is state support, right? That is planning. It's just planning in the wrong direction. And so I think, when you think about cost in that context, it's not really, I think it's not so easily deracinated, right? The cost is just, what is the government doing? And the government is, as we would hope and as we lay out in the book, is working toward a low carbon world and trying to build safety and prosperity for all. And so I think, immigration is obviously a huge part of what the sort of next century is going to look like. We know that climate change is already displacing people from the global south and bringing them north. We know that there will be huge internal migrations within countries. And so if we think about the Green New Deal as this much broader framework, the question isn't what is our border policy? The question is, what do we owe to fellow human beings, right? And what kind of, do we want to be a welcoming country? Do we want to be a country that, is not sort of operating on the basis of scarcity and that we, you know, only have so many resources we can distribute? Or do we know, as I think is sort of inherent in most Green New Deal proposals, that we actually have a lot, right? We have a lot to work with, and that you know, there's no sort of shortage to go around for, you know, just all of what we can share, and we can, you know, make the table longer, not close the kitchen, right? So I think that's how I would think about it, is just you know, to really broaden kind of what it is the Green New Deal is doing. And you know, that's the New Deal famously sort of created the New Deal order, and so I think the Green New Deal order will be, you know, the sort of style of governing that is just as expansive, if not more.
Let me just jump on really quickly. I totally agree with that, although I just want to state for the record, I spent a long time finding an expandable table, and I hardly ever expand it. It's such a pain in the ass. But you know, budgetarily, we can do it. I think if you know, I think frankly speaking, like Pennsylvania is not a fabulously wealthy state. Philly is not a hugely wealthy city, and I think that means that to a large extent we have to fight for access to federal funds. And that also means that now, with the possibility of a stimulus, I would really urge all of us in Philly to try to get unfundable plans on the table for the city and the state, so that we have like shovel-ready projects ready when the federal stimulus comes. Because otherwise, they'll say who's got a project, and California and New York will have projects because they can fund them, and we won't. So I think we have to not shy away from literally preparing projects that we can't afford, in the expectation that there's going to be money from, like, you know, Department of Housing, HUD, Department of Transportation, you name it. The other thing though is we have to fight to increase tax revenue in locally. And there are challenges in PA with the state constitution, the Commonwealth Constitution, that other people on this call probably know more about the exact details than I do. But there are things that we can do, push for, to get more progressive taxation. I think anybody in Philadelphia and Philly, you just have to go to Bryn Mawr. Like, if you could put an ice cream scoop into those mansions, you could find a lot of things that we need in Philly. So we need strategies to, federally speaking, the federal government can authorize funding in a way that is not tied to tax revenue, but locally that's not exactly the case. And so I think we should, you know, in Red Vienna, which has the most successful public housing program in the world, and now a third of the housing is public and a third is cooperative. In Red Vienna, the finance minister of Red Vienna in the 1920s was known as the tax sadist, because 40% of the property tax came from the 0.5% richest properties. So I think we do need to find ways to make the wealthy in the state pay their fair share, and that will be an important part locally. But that is not, that is one piece, and then the other piece is getting ready for more federal money, and we have to fight for it. We just have to fight for it, and that's one of the reasons why we have to leave the city and organize all throughout rural Pennsylvania, is because we need to make the federal investment happen.
Cool.
And we're going to make it happen.
You both mentioned, say what? You both mentioned PGW and utilities, so a couple people had brought that up, and I wanted to make sure we talked about that. Someone says, where is it? So they say we have a small version of nationalized fossil fuels in Philly, as PGW, the gas works, is municipally owned. But what argument would you make for unions as to why we should, they say abolish, but as you said, transform PGW and use their skills for renewable energy? As you may or may not know, there was recently a fight. PGW wants to build a liquefied natural gas plant, and the unions were a big proponent of that. So what is the argument to say to them, like, hey, we need to not do that?
Man, I think I would start by saying it's going to be hard to get every worker on board for a promise. And to some extent, I think we need to just start and see how we can build. I know there's a discussion of PGW doing a study on business diversification, and I think we can organize around that. You know, I think that sort of like core thing that we're proposing is to essentially, if you're talking about buildings, replace heating by furnace with heating by heat pumps, which are electric systems that are essentially like inside out air conditioners in terms of how they operate. And those pumping systems can then also usually provide air conditioning at the same time. And you can also use a slightly different version of that technology, but which is also a heat pump, to heat water. And that means that you can take all the systems and buildings that are being done with natural gas and do them with heat pumps, heat transfer pumps. And so I think the goal here is to say all that work of transition, and in particular in large buildings, should actually be done by PGW. PGW should be involved in that. They're already going and doing hookups in buildings and so on. And it's going to take sort of making the electric grid in the city more robust to handle the new electricity, because we're getting rid of more natural gas. So I think that if we can put a plan on the table that very clearly lays out that will actually maintain and in fact probably expand the amount of work done in PGW, then it becomes an operational challenge of taking the workers who are not able to retire, don't want to retire, and some substantial chunk of them, and eventually all of them, retraining them in the technologies that are involved with heat pump installation, heat pump operation, heat pump maintenance, and electric grid fortification within the city. So I guess that would be my strategy, is very, very concrete plans that demonstrate that there's work to be done and to allocate that work to PGW. I think we're very lucky. We're unlucky that we own a gas utility, but we're lucky that the gas utility we have, we own. And I think that puts us in a good position. And Philly is for the most part, does run on natural gas. And that means that there is a huge amount of work that's going to be required to undo that system and to replace it with something that actually works a lot better.
Yeah, I started to sort of mention this when I was talking earlier, but I think there's a big difference in general between something like nationalizing the fossil fuel industry and bringing utilities under public ownership, which is that we need utilities and we don't need fossil fuel companies, right? And so the missions are very different for what public ownership looks like, in that the mission of a publicly owned fossil fuel company is to wind down as quick as possible and give workers an off-ramp that gives them dignified lives. Whereas I think that mission looks very different for when you're talking about either bringing a currently private utility under public ownership or transforming an existing public utility to be better. I have spent a decent amount of time looking at rural electric cooperatives, which came out of the New Deal, and were founded on fairly radical principles by people who have been pushing for public power sort of against charges of red baiting for years and years and years, and were set up to be worker owned and run, really rooted in communities, seen as sort of engines of economic development for rural America, and in the last 60 and 70 years have devolved more or less. Many of them are very undemocratic. They are still legally cooperatives. They're still legally owned by their member owners, but often that leadership is sort of ceded to a largely unaccountable group of bureaucrats who've been there for 50 years, largely unrepresentative in many cases of the communities of the service area that they are ostensibly serving. And so I don't think public ownership is a solve, right? I don't think, that simply having something be owned by a municipality or a city, or even by its workers or its, ratepayers, solves any problems. And I think the context really matters, right? And so in the case of PGW, this municipally owned gas company, I think that is a project of transformation, right? As sort of Daniel was mentioning, is that we wage campaigns against public institutions all the time, right? The Philadelphia school system, the New York City school system, right? These are also fights to be had, and I think sort of having that context in mind, that it's not. The question of ownership is one thing, and taking the profit motive out of the equation is huge, but that doesn't kind of get everywhere we need to be. And so I think the fight sort of doesn't end at changing an ownership structure of a utility, but really sort of begins and fighting for what that should look like. And I think the sort of less relevant to PGW, but when you think about something like PG&E, the sort of massive electric utility that caused the wildfires in California, the context by which PG&E would be brought under public ownership matters a lot, right? If that is a fight for decarbonization, if that is a fight by a working class coalition that wants a Green New Deal, looks very different than if Gavin Newsom signs a piece of paper and makes it, PG&E at the state utility. And so I think that the sort of battle by which things are, change hands is really important.
Cool. Yeah. Let's see. And the other side of, wait, sorry. Someone asked about the refinery, the infamous refinery of ours in Philly that exploded over the summer. I'm looking for the question. What does it look like if PES, that's the refinery, was publicly owned? How would a public decommissioning of the refinery be different than private management? And, could the refinery be turned into something like a solar farm or a geothermal plant or something?
Look, I think there are people on this call who know more about this issue than I do. I saw Alexa on there. So many amazing friends and comrades on this call. I think stepping back a tiny bit from the specifics of the case, one of the issues to me that this really exemplifies, which is so tragic, and Mindy Eiser has written about this as well, is that fossil fuel companies are hostage takers, and the hostages are the workers and the rest of us. And they tell us, you need us for your energy. And to the workers, they say, you need us for your jobs. And when the fossil fuel company wants to advocate for public funds, public bailouts, they put the workers in the window. And for the workers and the unions, one might wish that they had a different strategy. At the same time, in this economy, you don't want to lose your job. And exactly like Kate was saying earlier, those are often very good jobs. So I guess to me, it's like, I don't care about replacing energy infrastructure one for one. I mean, the PES doesn't have to be a solar farm to me. It's on land that's going to be flooded pretty soon. Certainly very vulnerable to sea level rise. We should make the appropriate decision for that. I guess what I worry about is the workers and how can we ensure, and I think only public ownership can do this. How can we ensure that workers' pensions are made whole, that their salaries are maintained, that they don't pay the price for the criminal decisions of the hostage takers, namely the bosses? So I think the public sector has a huge role to play in terms of that just transition for workers, making sure that the wage level is maintained for many years, the retraining, the housing assistance, the social services, until we make them all free, and so on. That to me is really essential. And I think that when you're replacing fossil fuel infrastructure and unbuilding it, it should be replaced according to the needs of the communities that are present. And I don't think I think it's a very good idea to replace fossil fuel infrastructure with renewable infrastructure, obviously, but I think it doesn't always have to be one for one. Like there's a great idea to replace Rikers with a solar farm. That seems great. Like not every jail has to be replaced with a school. Not every gas pipeline has to be replaced with a wind turbine. I mean, that's just going to depend. I think we really need to take care of the people, and we need communities to have a real say on the kinds of infrastructure that's built around them for their benefit.
The other thing I would add, just on the sort of question of a just transition, is that a lot of the unions which employ refinery workers and employ fossil fuel folks kind of along the fossil fuel supply chain also do a lot of work in renewables. So, the United Steelworkers, for instance, which employ a lot of refinery workers, also, they also have renewables training programs, right? And so I was talking a couple weeks ago to folks in Texas who are preparing for the AFL-CIO convention, where they endorsed several candidates who came out for the Green New Deal. I think getting into like what the specifics of like even the work covered within a union is really crucial, right? I mean, there are folks in the IBEW who are pushing for a Green New Deal and who do electrification work and who can, have a lot to gain from a Green New Deal, from wiring up buildings, retrofitting, and all of that. And then there are also coal plant workers in that union who, will face a different kind of transition, right? And so I think part of that is, part of that work is supporting kind of rank and file struggles within those unions, because I think folks, you know, who are also in the unions are maybe better suited to make that case, you know, than myself or Daniel, right, to those workers. And so I think a lot of this also depends if we're, you know, fighting for a really democratic Green New Deal, sort of figuring out ways for those conversations to be had within unions and for folks to really map a transition that works for them.
And just quickly, people down the side, I'm reading your comments. Thank you.
Green New Deal. Okay.
Green New Deal. But yes, the soil does need to be remediated. And it is absolutely scandalous that the executives of that company were able to take money away. I mean, all the money that goes into things like making the workers whole. I mean, you actually have to stop corporations from being able to, like, you know, leave the trash and run. And so if there were ever a reason to increase the power of auditors and, you know, repressive authorities of the state, it's to go after these fossil fuel hostage takers.
Yeah, there's some good discussion happening in the chat. I'm excited that everyone wants to talk so much and at once about everything. Another question, so the pandemic presents many opportunities for investing in public health and sustainability, as does the Green New Deal, obviously. But there are also threats from disaster capitalists and the authoritarian angle. Can we talk about that, like the risk of that, that, you know, the reaction from the state, especially to the pandemic, where there's, you know, the possibility of increased police state influences, you know, ICE is still raiding hospitals and stuff like that when people are going to get treatment. So just the threat of the rise of authoritarianism in, you know, the face of this pandemic and possible federal expansion of investment and stuff like that.
Kate?
Yeah, I'm just following the discussion and then the comments is like, my brain does not process that much information at the same time. So apologies for that. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this sort of like totally bizarre moment we're all in now. And I think that's right. I mean, I think these moments can go, you know, in a number of directions, right? If we look at the 1930s alone, the United States did not take the path that a lot of Western Europe took toward fascism, right? The United States did not, you know, do everything right, certainly in the 1930s. There are a lot of, you know, sort of scary elements of what the state looked like during that time, but certainly it was not Nazi Germany, right? And so I don't think there are easy answers to this, but I think it really behooves folks on the left to be fighting for an alternative that looks tangible. In the last couple of days, I've been working on a project that is looking at the New Deal in particular and looking at Herbert Hoover's early reaction to it. And I think that gets remembered in a similar, you know, somewhat analogous period of crisis in American history. Hoover is kind of remembered as this bumbling idiot, right, who just failed to deal with the New Deal, failed to deal with the Great Depression, was totally tone deaf, just got everything wrong. But what gets, you know, kind of forgotten about that was also enormously, enormously cruel. 1.8 million people were forcibly repatriated. 60% of them being American citizens, right? Between, I think mostly that was in 1931 by the Department of Labor. Because that is, you know, as we've seen in the last couple of days, just the default reaction of leaders who don't know how to deal with a crisis, right? Is to find scapegoats, to blame usually brown folks, usually working class folks, and just sort of cast all the blame onto other people. And so in the absence of real tangible alternatives, in the absence of another sort of challenging political project, that is kind of what will thrive, right? And so I think, you know, in the last 90 years or so, we've seen that kind of mapped onto neoliberalism and the kind of disaster capitalist script that Naomi Klein has talked about, which I'm seeing people kind of mention in the comments, which is just to hand as much as possible over over to corporations, including in ways that have nothing to do with the actual crisis at hand. Bailing out the oil and gas companies is not a way that you deal with a pandemic, obviously, right? It's kind of absurd to think about that, but it is what we're seeing. There's just a sort of set of scripts lying around for the things you can push through in a moment of crisis, and that is what we're getting. And I think in the absence of something that really looks like a real answer to it, not just sort of platitudes, not just saying that we need something else, but real sort of hard policy, what will flourish is nothing good. And I think that's what's so, I'm sure has been troubling to folks on this call, and has been troubling to me following the news in the last couple of days, is just watching the Democratic establishment just totally flail through this moment, to have no real answer to what's happening, and just sort of negotiate down their own proposals before they even reach the public. And so I think the time is really ripe for there to be something else inserted into that conversation. And it's really, frankly, just quite scary to see just how much this moment is kind of being is playing out sort of on the train the right is riding.
Oh, I have nothing to add. That's a really great answer.
Yeah, that was great. So there's a good question about PHA, which is, I'm guessing, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and solarizing the PHA. Can we talk about, I guess, what we can do with public housing in the city, at the city or state level, as far as using renewable infrastructure and that as a jobs program too, or like internship programs for high school students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I helped, that's a weird, anyway. I helped AOC and Bernie write this Green New Deal for Public Housing Act and research it. And we talk about the Green New Deal for public housing in the book as well. And it's, public housing is often in very, very bad shape. There's 1 million units of public housing across the country with about 2 million people living in them. And many of them are in Philadelphia and in PA, including in rural Pennsylvania as well. And so we absolutely can and must create jobs, not just solarizing them, certainly adding some solar panels, but also getting rid of the mold and the flaking lead paint, other unsanitary conditions, and really modernizing and beautifying these units. In Europe last year, the Mies van der Rohe Prize for Architecture, a European-wide prize, went to a public housing green retrofit in Bordeaux, France, which was beautiful. So, one of the leading edges actually of architectural and operational at the kind of buildings level and even financial ingenuity, if you can call it that, is in public housing retrofits that are green and that really benefit the people in them. So I think we absolutely have to do that. We need a much broader conversation, I think, about what the green housing justice looks like in Philly, because most people, including most low-income people, don't live in public housing. So one idea that's in the Nikhil Saval campaign, which I'm really excited about, and that we drew inspiration for this idea from a campaign in Baltimore, is the idea of a kind of mass program of retrofitting vacant or dilapidated row houses and turning them into community land trust properties and moving them permanently off of the housing market so that the families living in them have complete stability indefinitely. There are about 25,000 of these vacant homes in Philly. We think we could turn that into housing for 125,000 people. That would take a huge amount of work to retrofit and get those buildings into good shape. And again, this would create affordable housing off the market for an extremely long time. And this is something that a group called United Workers is doing in Baltimore right now. We need some state public investment up front to make those repairs and to take ownership of the land. And then we think it should be democratically managed by local organizations. And it could be a wide variety of organizations that ultimately take this up. And then the last thing I'll just say quickly on kind of green housing affordability is I hear so frustrating is there are these urbanists, and I love density and I love to be in, in a crowd, obviously. But what the idea is that is densifying Philly, like Broad Street, with only private developers. And we're supposed to believe that these luxury condos are one day going to be affordable to people, and they're not. What we need to do is bring density to different parts of the city, bring new construction, but a substantial amount of the new housing has to be below market rate, which means subsidized, and ideally a lot of that will be social housing, mixed income social housing or public housing. And we need rent control so that when investments are going into neighborhoods, that doesn't cause displacement of the very people who would benefit the most. If you don't have rent control and a neighborhood improves, quote unquote, then suddenly it becomes unaffordable often to many of the residents of that neighborhood. And tenants are especially vulnerable to displacement through gentrification. So I think we not only need to have green public housing, but more broadly, we need to have a vision of what we're trying to do is create communities that are much healthier, that have, when it's appropriate, more density, more public transit access, but that these improvements, which are green and improvements of convenience and infrastructure, don't displace anybody, but are actually about bringing more working class people into the city, more racialized communities, more poor people, and that everybody in Philly should have the option, if they want, to live a short walk from where they work, to live a short walk from school, short walk from daycare. So it's not pushing poor people out and bringing rich people in for a new urban utopia of yuppies, but is instead a kind of democratic access to density, democratic access to services and to walkability and to bikeability. Not walkability as like, oh, walkability, great, big score on Zillow, now you're rich. No, walkability is a right of everybody who lives in urban and rural and suburban communities. So I think that's a vision that we can move towards, and there's a lot of work being done on the ground. And that's, people on the side have been talking a bit about coalition building. I think we've seen with the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, when we can see this kind of policies more and more work together from housing organizations, housing justice groups, community justice groups, racial justice groups, and the environmental movement working, hand in hand for changes to the urban landscape and suburban landscape as well. Sorry, this is the thing I warned you about where I could talk for 1,000 years about housing. I hope you're all very comfortable.
I feel like we should just do a separate housing and Green New Deal event in the future, but that's just me.
Right, yeah, I've got a big catch. I'm ready.
All right, awesome. Maybe we should open it up and let people, Rick Krajewski, Nikhil Saval, there are two very great progressives running for state assembly in Pennsylvania right now to represent Philly. Do we want to open it up and let people, ask questions more directly or make comments more directly? There's a lot here, or I could just keep going through, the chat, John. Yes. Does anyone want to make a comment or a question for Kate and Daniel? You can, if you could type comment into the chat, please, and then, I'll call on somebody.
I'll just say while we're waiting, I saw somebody asked about electric buses. This is another one of my passions.
I was going to ask that just because I have no idea.
So the point is that if you have a rechargeable bus battery, it uses lithium, and lithium extraction can be very harmful for communities in the global south. We are going to need lithium, and that means that we need much better mining technologies and should probably be much more expensive, and we should use it more carefully, 100%. I think that with buses, this is kind of technical, but I think, and maybe in some ways helpful, is the idea that we're talking about is like a mass infusion of electric buses onto city streets. And the minute that you discover which corridors are most popular, you can then convert those into trolley buses, essentially, where it's similar to a streetcar, but with a bus. So that's actually pretty quick infrastructure to build. You don't have to lay rail, just electric line. And then the buses that are going on the trolley line, getting the energy from the line up top, don't need to have the same big heavy batteries inside. That's actually way more resource efficient. People, the lefties in Barcelona are obsessed with these trolley buses. And then once those trolley buses get really packed, that's when you can think about moving to light rail or even to a subway. So the idea is you kind of like sort of flood the streets with a network of buses that are going very, very often. And you just transition each route as it makes sense into a trolley line with a dedicated lane, maybe even like a physical separation, bus rapid transit style. And eventually, if the capacity is no longer able to be met by a bus, then you can move to rail. So we are going to use electric battery buses. However, that being said, as soon as we really have a full modal shift from cars to public transit, plus walking and biking, obviously, once we have that full modal shift, then everywhere where it's feasible, we shift to the trolley line. So it's a bit of a both and, but it's like once we have that like abundance of public investment perspective, then we can really do beautiful things.
Oh, someone said the magic word. Daniel, do you want to talk about degrowth?
Oh my God. Sure. The argument, so degrowth is this idea, and many of you might have seen it, exciting idea from Europe. You know, they all sit around in Barcelona in their secondhand waffle knits and talk about degrowth. No, but degrowth is very compelling. And what degrowth agenda comes out of is something called ecological economics, which is not the same as environmental economics. Environmental economists are fundamentally obsessed with changing prices. They think that will solve all of our problems. And ecological economists think that we have to understand the economy as being about the arrangement of physical things. And as they have noticed, very compelling, only environmental economists haven't figured this out, there is only so much stuff on this earth. And if we use it all, making each other extremely fabulously wealthy in the Western lifestyle, then eventually we run out and fuck everything up. So ecological economists, which have, and a strand of that has turned into the degrowth movement, are saying we simply use too much stuff and we have to stop growing the economy in the rich world. And Kate alluded to that earlier. And I think there's a lot that's right about that. My problem with the degrowth frame is that it's not very appealing, and we've been living under austerity for working people for 50 years. And so the argument that we make in the book is we need one last green stimulus to create the physical conditions under which we can have prosperity in the US and around the world, but using far fewer physical resources. So it's kind of like a Goldilocks position in a way, which is like, yes, technology is super important. We love things like electric buses. And yes, we do need to develop the economy and build new things that we don't have, whether it's parks or bus trolley lines. But the goal, even very short-term goal, is to reduce the amount of energy we use in absolute terms, reduce the amount of energy we use, reduce it, and create the physical conditions where we can work 20, 30 hours a week and spend much more time, you know, hanging out, playing sports, making plays in our bands, some version of the West Philly lifestyle, much more expanded. But I think in the very short term, the phrase degrowth, I have no problem with people using it, but I don't think that's a winning political frame. But I also don't think it's inconsistent with the vision that we're laying out. We're talking about a last green stimulus and absolutely short-term reductions in energy use through efficiency and through reorganizing how we live. And it will improve our living standards in every conceivable way. But yes, there will be more yoga and fewer trips to IKEA for end tables that we don't need.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think what I see sort of crop up in the growth and degrowth debates, and I think it's a limited array of the public that's invested in those debates, is it these sort of, right, like false dichotomies, and it's a sort of, you know, there's this widespread sense that growth and economic prosperity are the same thing. We know that's not true. There's, you know, mountains of empirical research to show us that's not true. And I think when the conversation is framed around the question of growth, I think that's tough for the left, right? Growth as itself is this relatively, you know, new concept. It was only a couple decades ago that the sort of health of economies was judged on much more material basis, like how many people don't have jobs, right? What is the sort of, you know, standard of living? There were much more sort of intuitive definitions of whether the economy was doing good than this sort of arbitrary basket of goods and how much things cost in it that leaves out all these things, and certain things get imputed, certain things don't. And I think, you know, we can have the argument and you know, make the case for the world we want to build without necessarily engaging on this, you know, terrain, which essentially has been built by the right and by fairly reactionary forces within the economics profession. And so I think my preference is always to sort of sidestep the question of growth or degrowth. And I, you know, I enjoy those, you know, some of those debates. And I think there are, you know, important points raised, especially by the ecological economists who, you know, sort of adhere to degrowth. But I think for, waging this sort of war of public relations, I don't always think it's the best sort of, terminology to be using.
So back to the discussion about the Baltimore Community Land Trust with unions. Can you talk about other grassroots direct organizing activities that can build towards the Green New Deal vision?
Maybe one campaign I think that's pretty interesting to think about from my point of view is the campaign that led New York to have arguably the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction bill for buildings in the country, one of the most aggressive in the world. So the law basically says that all large buildings, I don't remember the exact square footage, all large buildings have to retrofit themselves to cut their carbon emissions by 40% in a few years. And what's interesting about this from the perspective of what we were talking about earlier is that this is a case where the public is actually not putting up the money. There's like a small fund for technical assistance, but essentially what the public is saying is there's a big sector of the economy that is causing emissions that the owners of those buildings can pay for themselves. So like Trump Tower is one of the biggest emitters in New York City, actually, literally. 2% of the buildings, I think, are responsible for 50% of the carbon pollution in New York City. So there's a relatively small number of very big buildings. And the idea is, well, what if you could pass a law that would force those building owners to go to the bank, work out the financing, the upfront money, make these retrofits, and they will recover most or all of that money in a few years. So it's kind of a pain in the ass for the building owners to do, but at the same time, certainly they should pay for it. There's no reason why taxpayers or ordinary people should fit the bill for buildings to do something that will make them more efficient. So then the question is, okay, power analysis. How are you going to get these giant building owners to swallow this really annoying task that, yes, may ultimately pay for itself, but it's a big pain? And the answer is pressure from below. So in 2009, Mike Bloomberg, billionaire mayor, our good friend, who's now worth 65 billion, but at the time I think was only around 10 to 15 billion. When he was the mayor in 2009, he proposed something like this. And the real estate industry said, fuck that, we're not doing it. And city council was terrified of the real estate industry. And Mike Bloomberg had no coalition behind him except for a bunch of wonks. And so the bill just died, and they ended up passing something extremely weak, which was about reporting requirements and a bunch of paperwork, but no real change. Fast forward 10 years later, and suddenly de Blasio's mayor, but what's really important is that the housing movement gets together with the Working Families Party of New York City, with some labor unions, with some climate activists, and they say, you know what? We're gonna put the political pressure through the primary process, through electoral mechanisms on city councilors. We're gonna threaten them. DSA was really involved actually in this campaign. Very important, absolutely essential. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna pressure the city government to pass this bill, and we're gonna make a carve out so that no rent regulated apartments are gonna have to do this building efficiency until the state law changes, because the way that the state law was written at this time is that if a rent regulated apartment had an energy efficiency upgrade, then they could deregulate the rent of that apartment, and that would allow them to displace low income people. So the housing movement comes in and says, we're gonna decarbonize all these big buildings, but we're gonna protect low income renters. We're not gonna do anything until we can assure that low income renters are safe. That brings the housing movement in. They put a huge amount of pressure on city council, and in 2019, city council passes, basically an Earth Week, the most aggressive buildings carbon emissions reduction bill, thanks to pressure from below and from the housing movement. And this was huge. This is something that Bloomberg, the climate mayor, was not able to do, but it was done this time by this coalition, and it's going to create a ton of really good jobs. And let me just say one last thing. The role of the housing movement cannot be underestimated. The Real Estate Board of New York, extremely powerful real estate lobby in New York City, of all cities in the entire world, was completely opposed to this. And even though the Real Estate Board of New York was completely opposed to this bill, it passed 45-2. And the city councilor, Costa Constantinides, who proposed the bill, specifically called out on the floor of city council, and I was there. He specifically said, we couldn't do this without the housing movement pushing for this. And then he said something I thought that was actually kind of profound and very meaningful. He said, when mothers go to sleep at night, they shouldn't worry that their family, that they and their children will be displaced either by rising sea levels or by rising rents. And that's why we need this bill to cut carbon emissions in New York and to protect rent regulated apartments. So we could go and talk about other examples, but we talked a bit about Baltimore. I wanted to bring up this example in New York. You could have a version of that in Philly, but the point is you really do get power when you bring the organizations that are in the class struggle, housing and labor, together with environmentalists, and you take on big industries like real estate. And when you do that, when you build a big enough coalition, you can actually make the big industry pay for cleaning itself up. To me, that's a really, really good news story. And again, it's part of what makes it, I think, so powerful is it takes an idea that Bloomberg had, and with all his money and all his influence, he could not force real estate to swallow this idea. But when the left mobilizes from the bottom up and comes up with a much more social justice oriented version of that green idea, then it happens. And that's part of why I'm so excited to be in this climate movement today, is like we're finally learning that lesson. And as we tighten those links between groups, I think that like sector by sector, we can make this kind of advance forward. Sorry, I'm writing like a whole book chapter about this. So.
Yeah, no, housing is like the other big thing I work on personally. So I agree, this is huge. And I've personally been obsessed with how New York got that passed, considering the influence of the real estate industry. And yeah, it just sounds like, yeah, they just built the power. So I guess next question. Kate's written about a potential political realignment that unfortunately looks increasingly likely. How big of an obstacle would that represent to a Green New Deal project? And what's our best chance apart from Bernie for preventing it? Which I guess speaks to also what happens if Bernie's not the nominee or the president, as much as we would all like to see it.
Yeah, it's a good question. For folks who have not read that article, just to summarize, I sort of talk about the possibility of the stimulus package and, the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus and ensuing economic downturn, sort of seeing the US right and sort of Trump's people in particular kind of discover this thing that has existed in Europe for, a long time, which is the sort of marriage of xenophobic, racist, kind of hard borders policy with generous social spending. So probably the best example of this in Europe is Marine Le Pen and the sort of rebranded what was the Front National is now the National Assembly. And sort of, something that has been called kind of welfare chauvinism, essentially appealing to the economic well-being of white people in this, this very sort of scary definition of who gets, included in basic services, because the right in the United States has been so close to corporate America. It's never really developed that. It's never really had the sort of language to talk about a big welfare state or that, as being something a right-wing project would be interested in. There's been sort of attempts over the years. You saw Steve Bannon trying to do this several years ago. Is still trying to do it in some ways. Tucker Carlson, I think, is probably the person who articulates this position the best. Just because of the amount of corporate money, again, in the GOP, that has never really taken off in the same way. And the thing that, seemed true, last week and the week before, and seems probably more true this week, is that that might be changing, right? You might see a Trump administration potentially, which sees, big social spending, over $1 trillion potentially, as the key to a re-election, seeing, we'll send out $1,000, $2,000 checks to every American, put Trump's face on it, whatever. And you could have that paired with potentially a Democratic nominee in Joe Biden, who is a lifelong deficit hawk, who, has spent much of his career arguing for cutting Social Security, for reining in entitlements, for, constraining the deficit and putting, as he's put it, everything on the table in terms of scaling back, essentially the kind of New Deal order. And I think that creates a sort of really scary place for American politics. And I think, you know, the answer to that is not, I won't pretend this is a complete answer, but I think it is, you know, what the challenge has been to Democrats for a long time, which is, you know, just the force of social movements and kind of forcing people's hand into doing something better, right? I think, you know, I will be very happy if Bernie becomes the nominee. I'm not sure how likely that is at this point. I think it's, you know, important to work toward, certainly. But I think, you know, there was never going to be a scenario in which there wasn't a challenge to be made at whoever was in the White House. I think Bernie himself has been clear that, you know, it's not me, it's us, and that, you know, there would be a sort of relationship between social movements pushing for more and people on the inside, even if he were in office. And I think, you know, the balance there is different. If Joe Biden is in the White House, I'm slightly skeptical he gets there if this is really kind of where politics is heading. Would love to be proven wrong. If he's the nominee, I would, you know, rather have anything else than former years of Trump, of course. But I think the answer is just to, you know, mobilize people around it. And I think Bernie's campaign has really helped crystallize a real coalition that is fighting for a different vision of the world than this sort of zombie neoliberalism that I think is on offer from Joe Biden, and can really, you know, push for more. Whether that looks like enacting, you know, Bernie's Green New Deal as it's laid out, I don't think that's the case. But I think, you know, for instance, sort of publicly shaming his advisors who have taken, you know, millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry and keeping those people out of the administration is certainly kind of one path toward that, toward, you know, really electing more people in Congress who can force his hand, and just, you know, being clear to not repeat the mistakes in the early Obama era. If it does, you know, if it does end up being Joe Biden in the White House, and not giving, you know, essentially 3 years of buffer period before ramping up any pressure on him. And I think, you know, certainly folks that I've talked to are sort of clear that will be the case. I think we have two different enemies, right? If it's Biden or Trump in the White House. And so I think the fight looks different depending on who's there, but it is a fight. Nonetheless, and I, you know, am holding out some hope that there, you know, we have champions in Congress like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, who can, you know, really be the voice for a different kind of stimulus, and make that case, I think, more clearly than someone like Nancy Pelosi has so far.
Yeah, let me just pick up really quickly on that. I think that's totally right. I mean, I think first, like, until Bernie drops out, I mean, his campaign is the main leverage that we have right now. There are people who think we should just like bail and then just have meetings with Biden's advisors. Yeah, fucking right. But that being said, yeah, I think, you know, Roosevelt, look, Biden is no Roosevelt, period. Roosevelt also campaigned on a 25% budget cut. So there will be an opportunity if Biden somehow wins, becomes president, to push from below. There was no one really on the street fighting over the terms of the Obama stimulus in 2008, and we are not going to make that mistake again. There's not a chance in hell we're going to make that mistake again. There are going to be a lot of people on the streets. In addition, as exactly Kate was saying, there's the House of Representatives, there's the Squad and their friends, and there's the Senate. And at the end of the day, even if Bernie were in, the trouble would be getting something really good through the Senate and the House. And that's going to be the exact same trouble through Biden, except this time we're not going to wait for the PDF to come from the White House, but we're going to bring the PDF to DC in the streets. And I think there's going to be a big opportunity. And then, of course, 2021, the primaries start. Halfway through 2021, Biden will have already given up the presidency to Kamala or whoever his VP is. There's going to be the 2022 midterms, which hopefully will win. 2023 primary season for the presidential race. And that entire time, all the organizing we have to do on the ground that's outside of the electoral framework. So I think we sort of just have like a huge amount of class struggle ahead of us pretty much no matter what. But there are still channels for getting green stimulus policies, egalitarian green investments on the table. And I don't think, I mean, Kate, I think we both really were excited about Bernie and thought that he could win. But I think we also both, I don't think any of us thought that the most radical and ambitious things were going to happen in 2021. I think for us, the Green New Deal decade is a decade, and it's going to take some building because we're not as strong on the left as they were even, let's say, in 33, 34. So we got to build, and winning elections is nice, but that's really going to be the symptom of that's going to be the expression of our strength, not the maker of our strength.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And just to add quickly a sort of, semi-hopeful anecdote from the New Deal itself is that some of the biggest programs that we remember from the New Deal, some of the most kind of radical parts of it, didn't come until the second New Deal, didn't come until after, there was a new class of people in office who really forced Roosevelt's hand in a big way, who had come out of social movements, who had come out of labor, and, really forcefully made that case from the halls of Congress, sort of bringing the full weight of, the strikes and the sort of outside agitation that was happening in. And so I think we're starting to already see the sort of foundations for that kind of relationship. And, in ways that are certainly better than they were in 1936. And so I think that's what gives me hope is that, none of this ends, right? None of this ends when Bernie drops out, doesn't end with election day, no matter who's in office, that this is, sort of constant struggle. And as Daniel was mentioning at the beginning, we know that every, 10th of a degree translates into tens of thousands of lives. And so there's never sort of a case to be made for just, saying, well, we lost this one, give it up. This is, a decade of the Green New Deal, and that will be a decade of struggle. And, depending on who wins on November, that struggle will be more or less uphill.
Yeah. The only time you should ever imitate Nancy Pelosi is if you read a magazine with New York in the title and it has a middle-aged white man telling you that climate change is too late to stop and that you should just focus on your eggplant farm, or you should just focus on bird collections. And especially if the author of that article's first name is Jonathan, just tear it right up.
Deep cut.
Tear it right up.
I think that's a good, well, minus the little Nancy Pelosi tangent, I think that's a good bit to end on. Yeah, our fight doesn't necessarily end in November with whoever's elected. We're going to keep going. We're going to keep fighting and building power. And, as others have said, every 10th of a degree of warming that we stop is thousands and thousands of people's lives that we're helping to save. And especially in a city like Philly, where so many of us are marginalized and at risk, that means a lot. So yeah, we had this event going to 8:30, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, Kate and Daniel, for your great comments and participating in this discussion. Thank you, everyone who, lots of good comments in the chat. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody. I'm really excited that everyone is so pumped to talk about a Green New Deal. So like I said, I don't think this is going to be the last event we do. We were talking in the chat about a viewing night for some documentaries and Green New Deal and housing. So there's a lot more we can talk about this. A lot more we can say, and we're going to keep talking about it. Just some housekeeping bits. We're going to send out a follow-up email with a recording. We recorded this call, so there will be a recording. We're going to send a cleaned up transcript of the chat because there's some good questions and food for thought in there. It'll include a list of all the co-sponsoring groups, and in light of the COVID pandemic, we're going to send out a little resource sheet, which is by no means the end all be all. There's a bunch of these things floating around, but just a list of different resources for ways to get involved in Philly, mutual aid groups, resources, information that pertains to, local organizing around the pandemic. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you, everybody. And good night. Unless someone else, Anthony or Mitch, you guys have something to say.
Can I just say just extremely quickly?
Yes.
I love the conversation. I think Kate and I are not specialists in Philadelphia politics, but we are both tracking things in Philly. I am more obviously And, you know, you have people like Helen Gim in office, Kendra Brooks, who's just come in, people like Nikhil and Rick who are running. I think there's this call with dozens of people, you know, on a Tuesday night. There's a huge amount of momentum for Philly specific Green New Deal organizing, and that too can absolutely proceed no matter what happens federally. So, I think we're both here and available and want to be involved in those conversations. And this is just it's a horrible time to be alive in many ways, but a very powerful time to be in the climate movement. And I think we can feel good about that. And there's work to do and people to do it with. And that's a good situation to be in, because I don't even know if it felt like that 3 or 4 years ago. So we have,
as a local climate organizer, I'm so fucking jazzed by the energy right now. Let's keep this going for sure. Mitch, do you want to take a minute and say something to wrap up? Which you said you did.
Oops, sorry, I did, but then I couldn't figure out how to unmute. Yeah, thanks so much to everyone for participating. Let me get myself on screen here for a second. Yeah, I was really excited by all the energy and good ideas that are flowing. And just to say, there are, like Sus said, we'll send out a list of all the groups, and there are a lot of conversations happening already about some of the ideas that were talked about here. There's organizing around improving public transit. There's organizing around getting electrified public transit in Philly as well. There's an informal coalition of groups that started meeting to talk about how we transform PGW into a utility that provides non-carbon heating services and transitions all the buildings in Philly to be heated with renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. And so I feel like, personally, I feel very overwhelmed, to be honest, at the moment, by trying to figure out how to do climate work in the current moment where people are struggling with where people who are already struggling with day-to-day survival needs are now struggling even more with even more intense survival needs. But I think we can figure out how to keep moving all the pieces ahead. And I'm really excited to work with folks who are on the call today on those things. So we'll be in touch about existing initiatives and maybe talking about how we can start some new initiatives.
Yes, let's do it. Green New Deal Philly, soft pretzels for all. All right. Once again, thank you, everybody. Have a great night. Solidarity forever. Love y'all. Have a good night. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Al.
Thank you.